5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff.
Welcome to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Co-pilot Pearson and I are on our summer break, but to help keep you sane, dear citizens of Planet Normal, while we're away, we're bringing you some of our biggest interviews from our recent archive, the discussions we've had on Planet Normal, the rocket of right thinking, the flying refuge of reasoned views. Also in January this year, I interviewed legendary former frontman of the Undertones turned water campaigner, Feargal Sharkey. As well as discussing the state of the UK's waterways, a subject close to Sharkey's heart since his childhood days fishing in his native Northern Ireland, we also discussed relations between Britain and the UK post-Brexit, as well as a musical career creating such legendary hits as Teenage Kicks, Jimmy Jimmy, and My Perfect Cousin. I started by asking Feargal Sharkey about his lifelong love of fishing. Feargal, we'll get on to your musical career, but I have to ask you first about your campaign for the environment, the cleanliness of water. It stems, doesn't it, for your passion for fishing?
It certainly does. I've spent 50 years now, more than that actually, standing about in the middle of rivers, waving bits of cane, carbon fibre, fiberglass around my head in a futile attempt to persuade trout and salmon to be obliging enough to hold on to the end of my fly line.
A lot of people don't get fishing. It is, though, the biggest single participation sport in Britain. What is it about testing your wits against these incredibly clever fish, catching them, and then for the most part throwing them back?
Ironically enough, you go back to a man called Isaac Walton, who back in 1653 wrote a little book called The Complete Angler, who I think described it best when he said, "Is it not an art to deceive a trout with an artificial fly?" A trout. And for me, I've always had one of those brains that there's always 50,000 things buzzing around inside my head, and there's just this constant noise. And fly fishing, which doesn't actually involve sitting around, for me, it is one of the few things I can find in life where I want to focus on it so utterly intently to deceive that wild animal, that wild fish, that this thing that I've tied using old bits of silk and feather and thread is actually a living, breathing insect that it wants to consume and wants to eat. And such is my focus to achieve that, it allows me to push all of the other noise and static into the back of my mind, and that in itself becomes this weird, strange form of relaxation.
So tell us about the threat to our river courses, Feargal. You've talked about concerns you have about the water industry. You've talked about concerns you have about agriculture.
Well, in reality, what we're looking at is a situation where in the modern world, there is not a single river in England that is currently graded as being in good ecological condition. Not one. Every single river in the country is polluted. And yes, as you've touched upon, two of the biggest forms of that pollution and directly responsible for it is agriculture and the water industry. And for me, what that translates into is simply a physical manifestation of the failure of political oversight and the failure of regulation and the failure of those that we have appointed and anointed to secure our environment, to look after, to protect it, have colossally failed at the job that we've given them. And in reality, that's what's been motivating me and driving me over the last 3 or 4 years now, is simply to highlight that utter failure of regulation, that failure of political oversight. That created a vacuum. The water industry particularly has decided to fill that vacuum to the extent that they have paid themselves about £72 billion in dividends. That's bill payers' money. And in exchange, we've been given rivers and beaches full of sewage, or to compress it into a single sentence, we've been cheated.
You've written, Feargal, that the government's terrified of making the private water companies liable for the damage that they've done for pumping sewage into rivers, because if they do, then those companies would have to declare themselves bankrupt and the government would have an even bigger problem. What changes do you want to see in the structure of the water industry? Maybe changes of ownership?
Well, in terms of the ownership itself, I don't think that's specifically right now the issue. Have those water companies utilised that failure of regulation and the failure of the politics to their own benefit? Yes, they've over-abstracted and I would say profiteered off the back of that failure. There's been enormous amounts of financial engineering going on, to the extent that I think collectively now the industry's looking at about £64 billion worth of debt that those companies are carrying. It's got to such an extent that last summer, Thames Water, in fact, came teeteringly close to bankruptcy simply because they can't afford to pay the levels of debt and the interest payments. And in fact, there's another interest payment coming up in April of this year. And it's looking likely at the minute that Thames Water simply do not have the cash available to pay that interest payment. And are now asking the regulator for a 28% increase in bills simply to compensate for their mismanagement and their corporate greed over the last 30 years. So for me, it's not about the ownership of the companies. It's actually about the regulation of those companies. I personally feel all of the power is there, all of the legislation there. It's an oft-quoted phrase, the regulators don't have the teeth. In this case, it isn't true. There's enormous amounts of power available to the regulator. They've simply never had the ambition or the desire or drive to utilise it and do their job properly. Let's enforce the law for a while and then we'll see how far we get.
Tell us about the extent of the sewage in Britain's rivers, how it compares to previous periods in our history, how it compares to other countries.
Well, the simple truth is the law that applies to all of this is actually European and comes from a European directive, and specifically enough, particularly the Water Framework Directive, which ironically enough at the time was acknowledged as in Brussels and indeed was referred to as the British Directive. And the original ambition of that was by 2015, every single water body in Britain, and that's every river, every lake, every stream, every pond, every single water body would be and attain good ecological status. Now, there were a number of caveats that you could push that deadline back. The current deadline, and it's the backstop, is 2027. I think by 2009, about 24% of rivers in England were attaining good ecological status. By 2015, that had slipped to about 16%. By 2019, it was down to 14%. And by 2027, the current objective is and forecast is, unless something truly drastic happens, by 2027, the final deadline, just 6% of England's rivers will be and attain good ecological status. So as you can see, instead of getting better, things have actually been getting progressively and demonstrably worse.
Well, I must say, you have used your profile, your name recognition to really put this issue on the map. But let's just talk a bit. I can't resist Feargal Sharkey, the man, the music, the band. What was it like growing up in Derry in the mid-70s, Feargal? What motivated you and your friends to go along to the local scout hut and make music?
The simple truth is, what motivates any teenager to get involved in making music, or indeed anybody, but particularly teenagers? It's two essential ingredients. One, being a huge, passionate and massively interested and engaged and absorbed about music. And secondly, being completely and utterly bored as a teenager. So invariably, four other equally bored, disinterested, hormone-ridden, sexually frustrated teenage boys, five of us drifted together and completely randomly decided we were going to form a band. Nobody could play anything. Nobody had actually ever been behind the drum kit or even held a bass guitar. And in fact, we didn't have any equipment. It was simply 5 bored teenagers going, I know, let's form a band. And it became the Undertones.
So you were 17, 18 years old in the mid-70s when the band was formed. What was the 17 or 18-year-old Feargal Sharkey like? Were you the natural front man?
All my friends at this point will be rolling their eyes, going, he's going to deny it, but it's completely true. Shall we just say I still, and maybe that goes back to the environmental thing, where I suspect I've always had a lot to say. And any opportunity to stand in front of a microphone, or indeed at this specific moment, particularly when I felt I had something to say, I think we may have naturally drifted into that idea. Well, he's kind of the gobby one, so we'll put him at the front. And he's the one that likes to show off. And my close friends would probably argue that I've not changed in the least.
So you famously sent a tape to John Peel, the iconic radio DJ who specialised really in giving a leg up to unknown bands. Like so many young bands at the time, you saw John Peel as a potential way into the music industry. How did it feel to hear John Peel play Teenage Kicks, not once, but twice in a row?
That was a pretty extraordinary thing. We were all sitting in those days in Ireland, and no doubt the same thing applied in England. There was the front room, and that was the kind of sitting room that was normally out of bounds. I think the whole band were there waiting for it to happen. We knew in advance that John was likely to play it, as he basically had told us. And at that point, the good Lord could have come down on earth and claimed all of us. We could have killed our careers off right there and then, and we would have seen it as a massive success.
You produced, as if anybody doesn't know, according to John Peel, according to many music aficionados, the perfect sort of pop punk song. It's 2.5 minutes long. It's got an intro that's totally iconic. Did you know when you first heard that song, when you first performed that song, how special it was?
Oh, wait, listen, we had no idea. Teenage Kicks was originally released on an EP with 3 other songs on it. And I think collectively, we didn't think Teenage Kicks was the best song on that EP. We all had much better other favourites. So it came as news to us. I think the biggest accolade of all, and I remember John telling me this, occasionally we would go meet up with John and go for a curry somewhere in the West End. And I remember on one occasion, John telling me that he was going to have it as his epitaph. I remember sitting there thinking, no, you're on your second pint of Cobra. It's late on a Friday night. But if you go to John's grave, you will see on his tombstone are carved the words, "A teenage dream so hard to beat."
I'm 10 years younger than you. I grew up following the music industry very, very closely. There's a lot of music in my family too. And as somebody of Irish origin in the UK back during those really difficult years, I was always astonished at the massive influence of Irish bands on the British music scene, despite the kind of political rancor between the two countries. It was absolutely huge, wasn't it? Why is it that the island of Ireland, has had such a massive impact on the British music industry, and Irish influenced pop music has been so hugely welcomed? British fans have roared their approval over many years, despite political difficulties.
Yeah, in fact, the first one goes back to early interviews that I would do overseas and outside the UK, and gently just steering people along this idea that we share a common language, but the Irish are a very different race and a very different culture of people to the English and the rest of the United Kingdom. And that's not a derogatory comment. We just are. Particularly in Ireland, there was that very, very deeply rooted lyrical music storytelling tradition. And in fact, that went on because of migration and immigration, particularly during the mid-1800s. That had a massive impact in places like Liverpool and Manchester. And in fact, my wife, Mrs. Sharkey, has recently written a book on that very topic. And it was that Celtic culture impacting on places like Liverpool, like Manchester, that helped give birth to rock and roll and the Beatles, and indeed in many ways, we weren't discovering the blues. We were simply re-importing Celtic culture, particularly from the west of Scotland and Ireland, that had been exported during the 17th century out into the colonies in North America. So there's a whole big tale out there. Go and look it up. But the truth is, in Ireland, I was always brought up, taught to read, encouraged to read, taught to discover culture, to have an opinion. I was allowed, in fact, it was almost demanded at home that I had an opinion. And in fact, the real failure that would be unforgivable was having an opinion but not being able to intellectually justify it. So in Ireland, as you know, Liam, particularly 100 years ago, there was a system developed around education, and it did become that mantra of education, education, education. And Ireland these days, and I'm not looking at it through rose-tinted glasses, but it is now a modern, contemporary, successful, outward-looking, globally recognized country on the verge of declaring a budget surplus. And I guess the best indication I can give you of any of this is the way that Ireland's society has changed over the last 30 years, 40 years is just unrecognizable. And I guess best summed up, I occasionally see it in some places where men, particularly about to challenge young Irish women or young modern contemporary Irish women, and I normally nudge them very gently and very quietly, go, I think you're about to make a very big mistake, but if you're going to insist on this, give me a few minutes while I pull up a chair, because I'm about to watch you get your rear end handed to you on a plate. Because young Irish women in particular these days are confident, outward-looking, successful. They know the universe is theirs for the taking, and they're quite keen and hungry to take it.
Final question. You're ethnically Irish. You grew up in the UK. You live in England. You clearly have a deep respect and, may I say, love for England. What's the state at the moment of relations between the UK and the Republic of Ireland?
Well, I think overall they're reasonably okay. There is clearly a political issue right now over the fact that there isn't a government in Northern Ireland, and that clearly needs to be resolved sooner rather than later. I was back in Derry a matter of months ago, and the local MP, Colm Eastwood, was telling me that there's currently 20% of the population of Derry on a waiting list simply to see a consultant. And indeed, I guess the biggest manifestation on that, to bring it back to the environment, is the now absolutely unbelievably diabolical pollution and failing of the state of Lough Neagh and the blue-green algae, and the fact that that massive water body, the largest lake, and I think in the whole of Western Europe, is now massively polluted and environmentally failing. And it has in many ways simply become the physical manifestation of politics in Northern Ireland, poisoned. So in many ways, it's incredibly good. But by the way, I think it's now time for the grown-ups to get into the room and start putting in a parliament back together for the people of Northern Ireland. That's what they voted for. Now deliver it.
Feargal Sharkey, a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you for your time, Liam.
Now, in May, just as the general election campaign was getting started, an election which saw a change of government, of course, I spoke to Labour MP and women's rights advocate Rosie Duffield. As well as speaking up for the rights of single-sex spaces, Duffield, who was re-elected as MP for Canterbury, was also co-chaired Parliament's Birth Trauma Inquiry, which looked into how to provide better maternity services and reduce complications at childbirth. An MP who's received abuse from her own colleagues for questioning trans self-identification and who still asserts that she's yet to receive an apology from party leader Keir Starmer, I started by asking Rosie Duffield how she felt about being a member of the Labour Party.
It's a bit conflicting at the moment, if I'm honest, Liam. It's not the best time I've had in the party.
And why is that? Try and explain to listeners who haven't been keeping up with the thrills and spills of the debate on trans and other aspects of your relationship with the Labour leader.
It's just been like a roller coaster, really. Our leadership will sort of talk about women's rights and it sounds as though they're getting it, and then they'll sort of say something that completely contradicts what women are asking for, and it's been that kind of roller coaster for a good few years now.
Just to put this in context, when you've been speaking in the House of Commons, some of your own MPs have glared at you, stared at you in a threatening way. How did that make you feel?
I guess that's par for the course in the chamber in Parliament. You know, it's quite a sort of robust debate whenever we talk about these things. But what's really difficult is that every time I'm sort of on my side speaking from my benches, I've got usually a row of people behind me and they're chuntering quite loudly. And some of the things they say about not only women like me, but people opposite when they speak are really insulting and quite difficult to hear for the length of a debate. So after a while, I just try and leave, actually.
How have we got to the point, Rosie Duffield, where the views that you hold that biological women are women, but men who identify as women aren't women and thus shouldn't be given access to female-only spaces such as changing rooms? How have we got to the point where your take on that is seen as extreme within political circles, even though the vast majority of the population would agree with you?
I think it is a sign, really, of how out of touch some political bubbles are. I mean, before I got to Westminster, I heard Andy Burnham and others talk about the Westminster bubble, and I couldn't understand what that was. And I got here and we're just in this tiny little space or echo chamber, all the cliches. We're talking to each other and about each other. And some of the people on the extreme ends of either argument are very close to political leaders and they lobby them and they're kind of in their offices or whatever. And so you do get these extreme views, and the majority of the public, who we should be in touch with as politicians, by the way, every single day via email, if not in person, don't feel this way. So I'm kind of still fairly baffled as to why it's so difficult to understand where the majority of the public are on women's rights.
Now, I must say, since you entered Parliament in 2017, I've had several conversations with you. I've watched you closely. You're clearly, if I may say so, an extremely capable MP, very much ministerial material. Would you want to be a minister in a Labour government?
I'm not sure. I think the problem with being a minister is that you have to toe the party line. And recently, over the admission of a Tory colleague, I've seen my colleagues on my side contort themselves and come up with all kinds of spin that I know they don't believe in, and it's the exact opposite of what they might have said a week before about our new colleague. And I just look at them and feel faintly embarrassed. And I think if I was to toe the line and literally read every single script written for me, I think it would seem very fake. I think I would find that very difficult. But I think that's an understanding that if you're a minister, you have to go along with however absurd the lines are. You've got to go along with them 100%. And I don't think I would feel very comfortable doing that.
Keir Starmer perhaps sensing that so many people across, if you like, Middle England, mainstream voters, particularly women, are totally on your side and think you've been treated disgracefully. He recently invited you for peace talks, didn't he? How long did those peace talks last? And did he apologise?
Well, I had to mention to my whip, actually, that I was getting very fed up and I was very upset about recent additions to our benches. And then he said, should I try and get you a meeting? And we did eventually get a meeting, but not before they asked what it was for. And also, when I did get there, Keir only had about 20, 25 minutes. I think our chat lasted about 17 or 18 minutes, and certainly absolutely no apology whatsoever and no real indication that he understood why I was so unhappy.
He's just worried about winding up the hard left in his party, isn't he?
Potentially. You know, that's the joke, that my views are seen as kind of right wing. But actually, even though every time I read about myself, it's right of centre or right wing Labour politician, I'm not at all. I mean, I'm very angry about...
But you're absolutely not. You are a dyed-in-the-wool, if I may say so, Labour Party person. You are not a right-wing person, in my view.
No, that's the irony, but that's what the spin doctors will have tried to point me as, you know, that I'm at odds with the Labour Party. But I'm most angry at the moment about the 2-child limit and issues like that are fairly left of centre. So I think it's just convenient, you know, and if people have these extreme views and they they have managed to get right in there, right at the top of the Labour Party or politics, and they're very influential. I guess, how do you spin it? You spin it that I'm a difficult woman, or that I'm right wing, or that I'm out of step, or that I'm an old dinosaur. I mean, all of these things have been said about me, and I guess that's politics. It's a dirty game.
How do you feel that the Labour leader has been very keen to pose with another now Labour MP, Natalie Elphicke, MP for Dover, a neighbouring constituency to you, who was a Conservative? I mean, she is properly right-wing.
She's very right-wing, and it's utterly ridiculous. And nobody that I know in the Labour Party has any comprehension of why we would do that, why the leader would do that. It doesn't gain us anything at all. It's a bizarre move, to be honest.
You've also been co-chairing with Conservative MP Theo Clarke the Parliamentary Birth Trauma Inquiry. You've gathered evidence from more than 1,300 parents. You've presented the report to the Prime Minister this month. You're calling for a national plan to improve maternity care. But some of the findings in your report, in many cases, trauma was caused by mistakes and failures made before and during labour. Frequently, these errors were covered up by hospitals who frustrated parents' efforts to find answers. I thought the NHS was the best in the world, Rosie Duffield.
Oh, I think the NHS is under so much pressure, and it absolutely would be. The workforce is incredible, as you know, if you've had any dealings with them. And I think they've just had this storm of COVID, lack of investment, a real problem retaining staff, and staff morale is through the floor. I think all of those things, plus just the culture of not listening to women generally, it's all contributed. There's so many things to unpack, but I think we're getting there with understanding what needs to change.
The report found, quote, poor care is all too frequently tolerated as normal, and women are treated as an inconvenience. Let me say to you, Rosie Duffield, my kids are now in their late teens and early 20s, and my family's experience of childbirth within the NHS was also absolutely terrible. This was a long time before COVID.
Yeah, well, I'm really sorry. I mean, I hear that all the time. So yeah, you're right. That doesn't excuse it. I think we just have to make these changes dramatically, quickly, and it's not good enough. I mean, there's no excuse I'm going to make. It's not good enough. It's a basic, simple thing that the majority of women, want to go through at some point in their lives, and we should be able to handle it.
Are you glad then that Wes Streeting, the Labour Shadow Health Secretary, is striking a slightly different pose, if you like, in terms of Labour's positioning over the NHS? It's a service, he says, not a shrine. We got to stop treating it like a kind of religious cult. We need to reform the NHS. Do you think we should reform the NHS?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really sensible want, and it's hear all the time about how free it is, but we all pay for it, in some way or another. And the staff need realistic expectations, not to be called angels all the time. They're human beings doing a bloody difficult job. And they're ordinary human beings under a hell of a lot of pressure, but they also need realistic expectations and goals. And you're right, we don't need to deify them. We need to give them the right respect.
You've previously worked in the NHS, just like you've previously worked in education. So how do you feel when you're overseeing a report that says there were many stories of care that lacked compassion, including women not being listened to when they felt something was wrong, being mocked or shouted at, being denied basic needs such as pain relief? That isn't about money. That isn't about resources. That's about the attitudes of people working in the NHS, many of whom do a great job. But many of them don't.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is the largest workforce in the UK. But yeah, I mean, the duty of care is your number one thing when you're working in the NHS and you're working in schools and you're working with vulnerable people. So the people that we found that had been rude to patients, dismissed them, ignored them, there's no excuse for that. That's not okay. But we also need to give people the respect and the pay so that we attract the best kind of people to those roles. And you're right, there's so many brilliant people in the NHS, but of course there's going to be some bad apples as well. And the culture needs to change. The culture of listening to women who are the lowest level of employed staff as well as patients in these situations really needs to change.
We had, of course, didn't we, the extremely comprehensive Ockenden review into maternity services in parts of the NHS. Now we've had this review by yourself and a Conservative MP, a cross-party review delivered to the Prime Minister, extremely powerful. You don't pull your punches. What do you now want to happen with maternity services, Rosie Duffield? But what do you suspect will now happen?
I really hope the government are going to act on this. They've promised that they will. The Health Secretary was there at our launch and she's promised to implement lots of our asks, which is great. But it's going to take a while to turn it around. It's a huge ship, as you know. What we need is an independent kind of someone overseeing the situation, a bit like Ofsted, but we need someone looking at maternity care who is not biased, not actually within the NHS, but with the qualifications to do that. Someone like Donna Ockenden, perhaps. We need to end the postcode lottery. That's really important. We need to listen to women. We need to see the statistics on Black and Asian women dying in childbirth come right down. All of those things are really urgent, but we need staff to feel valued, respected and listened to, as well as patients.
Because the statistics for Black and Asian women are unfortunately disproportionately higher than they are for the population as a whole. It's not that you don't care about non-Black and non-Asian women in childbirth, of course you don't.
No, of course not. It's just that, yes, you're right. That particular demographic are really, they have the worst maternity outcomes and we need to stop that immediately.
Now, your maternity report, which is hugely important, and as you'll know, because you're a huge supporter of Planet Normal, Alison and I have been talking a lot about maternity services over the months and indeed years. And your report is hugely significant, but it's been overshadowed, hasn't it, to some degree, by the report into contaminated blood. Where do you think that stands in the sort of pantheon of UK scandals?
That's a really good question. And thank you, yes, both of you for talking about this and covering it as much as you do. It's really important that we get that out there and that women feel they're able to talk about it, because it's still a bit of a taboo, actually, talking about some of these things, and dads and what they've experienced, like you've mentioned. I think it is really scandalous, but what happens is that we don't join the dots. And with the blood scandal, everything was joined and made a national problem, just like the post office, and rightly so. But I think with maternity, we've been looking at various different trusts and what happens there. And we haven't been joining that up and learning and using best practice, just changing what's happened in one trust. My trust, for example, East Kent Maternity report was awful by Bill Kirkup, really damning. Babies dying that shouldn't have died. And that has started to change. So my trust has started to turn things around. But if we join it all up together nationally, that's going to be much more powerful, much more useful.
Sir Brian Falstaff, former High Court judge, of course, he hasn't minced his words, has he? This episode has been life-shattering, he says. Almost 3,000 people are so far known to have died after contracting HIV or hepatitis from those faulty blood transfusions between 1970 and 1998. How do we rebuild trust in the NHS and in the broader Hippocratic Oath? Sir Brian singles out NHS staff. He says ordinary people were, quotes, betrayed by doctors.
It's a really good question. How do we build trust? We've got to build trust by getting better, by never having these things happening again, either individually or on a large scale like this. And I think, it's $1 million question. I'm not going to pretend to know the answer, but things have to change. Wes's comment that you mentioned is really important. We've got to stop acting as though the NHS are sort of gods, and they're human beings with human problems and human issues, and humans make mistakes. We've got to be able to say that and criticise when that happens and stop it happening, and quickly, not just tolerate. And I think we have to be more prepared to call these things out. I've met lots of whistleblowers over the last few years with these various reports, and they are not listened to. We have to listen to them.
They're not only not listened to, they're often systematically smeared and intimidated.
Yeah, that's true as well. And we can't carry on like that. We just can't. The whole system's going to collapse otherwise. We do have to have trust in the NHS, and we should. I'm starting to get it back in my trust. So let's hope we do the right things and that starts to change.
I must say, since you entered politics, you've been far from a kind of lowly backbencher, even though you've just been on the backbenches and in opposition. You've carved out a big reputation for yourself, or indeed you've had it foisted upon you. Are you glad you came into politics, Rosie Duffield?
Yes, I love my day-to-day job. I love being a constituency MP and being a backbencher, which I will forever be under this leader, obviously. It just gives me a huge advantage that I get to spend more time in my constituency than others would if they've got a brief. And, I get to be a bit freer to say what I think is wrong and how I want things to change. And I don't think, like I said earlier, that I could be someone who kept quiet when I saw wrongdoing. But also, I came here as an ordinary person. I wasn't at university with other MPs. I'm not married to one. I'm not the sister of one. I'm not someone's best friend. I came here as an ordinary woman. So seeing those things with my normal person's eyes is quite shocking at times, but I'm going to carry on calling it out because that's what I'm there to do. I'm not there to be part of any establishment. And I think we need people like me telling the public the truth about politics, not spin. And I won't be able to do that ever, I don't think.
Finally and briefly, you really think that? You really think if Keir Starmer enters number 10, he won't have the guts to bring Rosie Duffield into his government?
There's been no indication that he's going to bring me onto the front bench. I mean, he's been there 4 years and he hasn't approached me yet. So I think it's pretty unlikely. I did have a front bench job and I unwittingly broke the rules of lockdown and lost it. But there are other people on the front bench who also did that. So I don't think that's the reason. I'm too critical of him and the party. And I think that's a no-no. You're not supposed to do that. I'm probably in the wilderness for a while, which is fine.
Rosie Duffield, Labour MP for Canterbury. Thanks so much for appearing on Planet Normal.
Thanks, Liam.
Thanks so much for joining us for this latest edition of Planet Normal. We'll have another selection of best of interviews from the last year next week. And Alison and I will be back with the very latest news and views from beyond the bubble on Thursday, the 22nd of August. In the meantime, stay in touch with us and with each other. Keep the emails rolling in to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk.
So if you enjoy Planet Normal, please leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen to this podcast, because it's really helpful and it cheers us up to see all the nice remarks.
And on that bombshell, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.